and I rise to speak to the message from the other place on Bill C-45. But before I start my remarks on that, I want to say that this is a very historic time, and it's a time that I am very proud of this legislation, this change, this vast change in social policy that we are making as a government. Madam Speaker, if we reflect on what it's like to go out for dinner with friends and have a beer or a glass of wine with dinner, and we think about the fact that there was a time when that was illegal and the provision of alcohol was controlled by the criminal underworld, and the act of partaking in alcohol was a crime. And it's almost impossible to imagine that that made sense at an earlier period, and it certainly doesn't make sense to us today. And in the same way, I think in the future we will be looking back at a time when cannabis was illegal, where it was criminalized, where it was purveyed by criminal gangs, and we will it's in a future day, the public in Canada will not be able to imagine how that could have made sense. And in fact, it doesn't make sense. And so that's why I'm so proud of what we're doing today. It doesn't make sense because it hasn't worked. Having the use of cannabis be a criminal matter as opposed to a health and safety matter just makes no sense. It creates massive profits for the Hells Angels and other organized criminals. It provides no safety in terms of what might be in the content of the product that is being consumed or what might be harmful. And, Madam Speaker, make no mistake, it is being consumed as an illegal activity notwithstanding, as a criminalized activity notwithstanding. Our young people are using this product at higher rates than virtually anywhere in the world. And so this is time, it's far past time to actually take the control and regulation out of the hands of the criminal underworld, where they've been profiting from it, and place the control and regulation into the hands of government, where health and safety aspects can actually be addressed by the government. And that's exactly why in 2011, after the election, I began to have this discussion in Ottawa with Liberal colleagues and saying, I think it's time we address the situation and we actually consider legalizing marijuana as a party. And I had the privilege of bringing a film called The Union, a documentary about the control and all of the negative aspects of that for our society, the control of cannabis by the criminal underworld, the kinds of shootouts on open streets in broad daylight in our cities when there were gang wars, the drawing into criminal activity of young people that were being recruited by the gangs to be part of their distribution network, and the hundreds of thousands of young Canadians that ended up in the justice system because of their involvement with cannabis. So it's with great pride and humility that I want to acknowledge this Parliament and this government for what we are doing here. This is a historic time. In 2011, it looked pretty impossible, I have to say, but our Prime Minister took the bull by the horns, made this commitment into our last election platform, and we have proceeded with this project. So, Madam Speaker, I'm now going to talk about some of the details of implementation so that we actually do this as best as we possibly can as a Parliament and as a government. So as others have already pointed out, both Houses of Parliament have conducted extensive studies of the proposed Cannabis Act. In the other place, Bill C-45 was studied by 5 different committees, which heard from over 200 experts and witnesses. 4 of those committees conducted an in-depth study of the specific aspects of the legislation and its implications. They've carefully assessed issues related to criminal law provisions, Indigenous persons, international obligations, and Canada's borders. And I want to add my voice to those who've acknowledged this important contribution and to thank the other place for its extensive work on this bill. As you know, the study of this proposed legislation by Parliament built on extensive work by the Task Force on Legalization and Regulation. In 2016, after the previous election, the task force undertook extensive consultations to hear from Canadians, from public health experts, law enforcement, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, Indigenous organizations, U.S. state governments with more experience administering cannabis regimes, and more. The proposed act was developed largely on the basis of the thoughtful advice of this task force, and the act has been carefully designed to support the policy objectives that are stated in Clause 7. It was carefully designed to ensure that its provisions comply with privacy and other obligations and respect the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So for these reasons, the amendments proposed by the other place had to be very carefully reviewed and assessed on the basis of whether they would support the bill's policy objectives and whether they could have unintended consequences. Based on this review, it is clear that some amendments would further improve the bill. In fact, the majority of the amendments brought forward, and they support its objectives. Others are problematic. For example, the amendment that would further clarify the requirements and the scope for the legislative review that will be undertaken 3 years after the coming into force of the Act is a positive improvement to the legislation. This amendment will establish a clear timeline of 18 months following the beginning of the review for the Minister to table in Parliament a report on the findings of the review. In line with the objective of a separate amendment in the other place, it is proposed that the Act clearly indicate that this legislative review will carefully consider the impacts of this legislation on public health, including on youth, the impacts on Indigenous peoples, and the impacts of home cultivation. On the other hand, however, a number of amendments adopted in the other place cannot be supported as they could create significant issues. This is the case, for example, of an amendment that would require that the minister collect and publicly disclose the names of every holder of a license or permit, including persons who have control of or have shares in corporations holding a license. This amendment would raise concerns from a privacy perspective and impose requirements on businesses operating in the legal cannabis industry that would be inconsistent with how businesses operate in operating in other Canadian industries are treated. And it would pose issues from an operational perspective. For example, the volatility of shareholding in a publicly traded corporation could make the proposed reporting requirements practically impossible to meet and could cause extreme delays in licensing. Health Canada has a robust physical and personnel security screening process in place for the existing cannabis for medical purposes industry designed to guard against infiltration by organized crime. All officers and directors of a company must undergo thorough law enforcement record checks prior to licensing. As a part of the new regulatory framework, Health Canada has proposed to expand the list of individuals that would require a security clearance to include the directors and officers of any controlling company, in addition to those of the licensed company. As we finalize our study of Bill C-45, I urge all parliamentarians to remember that this legislative framework is one of the pillars of a comprehensive public health approach the government is proposing to better protect Canadians and minimize the harms associated with cannabis use. The government is taking action in a number of key areas informed by the strict regulatory controls that are currently in place for Canadians who access cannabis for medical purposes and lessons learned from our considerable success in taking a public health approach for reducing tobacco smoking rates. Our strategies include efforts to educate Canadians about the harms and risks of cannabis use, promote healthy choices and reduce youth access, prevent problematic and high-risk patterns of use, and many more. Madam Speaker, it's important we consider the proposed legislation in the context of broader, proven strategies for protecting public health. The government has taken every reasonable action to ensure this bill is designed to take those things into account. I am proud of Bill C-45 and proud to